We're coming back into the part 2 segment of this freestyle lecture, in which we had pointed out we're going to be talking about the equinoxes and the solstice in relation to the Lent and Easter, and typically a mythological reality of the fact that we as human beings are on the earth and we have this astrological, astronomical knowledge, but we don't see its greater application into its being tied into the calendar cycle, the agrarian cycle, the fact that the whole Christian orientation of the church is based on a mythology of a man called Jesus Christ, which is synchronized to harmonize with the ancient naturalist or pagan mythological concepts of archetypes, enforcing symbolism that represent particular periods of the earth's fertility cycle as it moves around the sun. And normally in the tradition of spiritology, or in the ministry of spiritology, we emphasize research and usage of the Kemetic tradition as one of the most ancient and primordial to use to have applicable symbolisms to interpret other traditions and descend down through the various cultures and civilizations that came after it to have an understanding of their spiritual culture. But generally in this tradition, we've been talking a lot with references to the Norse tradition, which is what we know the Roman Catholic Church used with its own calendar system in establishing what we are using even here in Africa through the colonization of Britain and all of that. So like I said, it's deep. What we're doing in Africa with establishing the Ministry of Spiritology is we're creating a holistic spiritual platform for cultural teaching and awareness of our people, which is something that it's just needed, because we have now the Great Reset, which has brought a pandemic to the earth, but it's enforced now a realization in many of our people that there's a lot of knowledge and information that we had been overlooking, that throughout the lockdown we were able to access and pay attention to through our Android devices. So our ministry has been operating since 2007 underground with this objective that we reasoned and actually realized that the African awakening happened during the Great Reset and pandemic period. And I mean, it was lovely because our fellow ministers and brethren and participants, we realized that this is now our time to go public and start doing more work above ground. And we concluded that we're going to take advantage of the virtual platforms, which will allow the African continent and other naturalists who are following in this train of awakening to get access to the knowledge that we share in our underground conscious community here on the African continent, so that it can spread and grow. Truthfully, I want to give a lot of respect to the Common Sense family. Truthfully, there's the brother Avram Moshe in Accra, Ghana. Truthfully, I want to give him a lot of respect for what he's doing, because that's what we're talking about. You see it. When we talk about spiritology, we're talking about that aggregation of that spiritual awakening through movements even like the CSF that are coming out on the African continent right now, that are proving that it was just a matter of time. You see it. The enlightenment and greater light must shift back to the African continent and dispel all of the ignorance that is keeping the people in shackles. You see it. And there's a lot of ignorance because a lot of our people who don't actually recognize the fact that through this knowledge of astronomy, astrology, that people shouldn't mystify the cycles of agriculture on the earth to give you a mythological personified being that they tell you now is God. They tell you that this entity is the creator and source and reason why all of this occurs. And then they make you now submit yourself to that idea of their God, because you believe that this natural law phenomenon is occurring because of something that they claim to have come to and represent. It's dangerous. It's trigonology, like I said it. When you understand that what makes rain, hail, snow, and earthquakes is caused simply by the natural cosmic law orientation and rotation of the earth around the sun, then there's no reason for you to bow down to a man who's bringing you the idea of a mystery God. You see it. The ancestors created what the Romans called God, but we actually called Neter. You see it, because we wrote in Metu Neter what they called as hieroglyphs, but were archetypes or symbols, which when they were carved, those of us who were able to interpret them were able to understand the symbolic meanings in them in the various levels that they could be assigned, to not misinterpret them. So we knew that when we were drawing an entity like, let's say, the Greeks called Horus or Heru, you see it, the god of light, or Deus, you see it, maybe De Lumiere, something like that. I know that's what they're going to call it. But we knew that when we were drawing this falcon-headed archetype, right, and giving it a human body, we were giving it this head of a falcon. because the sun is inside the sky. And the falcon being a majestic being that flies in the sky, you see, it sees very far. It had qualities that we were able to archetypally represent in layers with the sun. So we would know when we saw the symbol of Horus, which was a falcon-headed personified entity, a nectar, that we were talking about the light and consciousness. We didn't worship a falcon head or bird head or animal headed god. And it's important. This point has to be reiterated in the context of this explanation of the equinoxes so that you really get the depth and value of this discussion and this teaching, how we're trying to break you free from this idea first of gods too, because we already did a lecture on that, but I want to reinforce this in this 4-part lecture on the equinoxes and solstices, because when we're breaking down astrology first as one of our core teachings in your introduction to the Ministry of Spiritology and introductory test through the freestyle lectures, it's important you have this understanding in you so that you can't be fooled again and we'll just be running with it. So you've got this orbit and moving around the earth. They're giving you this idea of January 1st being the beginning of the year. But January 1st is not the beginning of the year. January 1st only became the beginning of the year in 46 BCE when Julius Caesar, you see it, he discovered that they had been following the Alexandrian calendar, right? And that's, when we talk Alexander, that's Alexander the Macedonian, because the Greeks had first come in and conquered Kemet before the Persians had taken it. But you have to remember that Kemet, being the supreme civilization, had already set the pace of civilization and human culture for at least the last 3,000 to 4,000 years. Forget Sumeria, honestly. When they won't even talk about calendars, they'll start talking about Sumeria. Let's keep all of that aside and let's just talk about what the reality of the facts and human civilization with its migrations actually truly do prove. You see it? Because we have now civilizations like that we can trace back as far as even the 11th century BCE, before they went to start talking about Rakotis and wine. You see it? And then we want to look at the indigenous heritage. If we come down into what they're calling Lake Victoria, specifically, you see it, the Nalubale. We have traditions, spiritual traditions, and tribes and cultures and practices that trace themselves to that water body that are even antiquitous. When I want to say antiquitous, I mean, let's start going beyond 11th century BCE. We want to start talking about what the Europeans call undocumented history. You see it? So the interaction and reality of human beings observing and documenting the movement of the procession of the celestial bodies, the sun, moon, stars, and planets out of space, is something that has been going on for thousands of years on the planet. You can understand that we've been interacting in our migrations. We've been swapping knowledge, sharing knowledges. As you know, the pyramid too represented learning center with all of the other pyramids all over the earth synchronized, lined up with specific, the equator. And I mean, all of these things prove that when they try to tell you that the ancient people, our ancestors were primitive, nah, my people, that's a cover up, because they're using their knowledge and don't want to give credit to the source. You see it. So us coming out with our naturals ministry, like I said, we're taking it back. We're taking it back. We're liberating the world so that there can be peace, harmony once again. And we can share this knowledge freely and elevate ourselves in our cycles of incarnation as we come here. Because this is cyclical, though it's counterclockwise. You see it. And our ancestors recognize that the true natural first day of the year in any region of the earth that they would first have to settle would have to have its relationship to when they are able to plant their crops on the earth. Because what? That's the first phenomenal action of the earth's natural processes that occur inside each year. And what would a year just be now? A year was going to be a cycle of the sun's rotation, of the earth's rotation around the sun. Now the sun does have its own rotation, its galactic plane, which takes it 225 to 250 million years to make a complete rotation around the galaxy, and it's called the cosmic orbit. But when we're talking about the Earth specifically, we're talking about the Earth making its ecliptic plane orbit around the sun. And I mean, while the sun is also orbiting in its galactic plane around the universe clockwise, the Earth is moving counterclockwise. You see it? All of these celestial movements have their point of initiation eternally, essentially. That's what I want to really point out. I'm not saying that the Earth and the sun are eternal, but the whole expanse of what we call reality and its multi-dimensions is eternal. And what we have that they're calling the Big Bang is now only a manifestation of a particular cycle inside an overlay and overlapping of an infinite procession of reality and existence. You see it? So what they're coming now and just because I'm saying this because someone's going to ask this question: when did the cycle actually start? And the religious Christians, they always want to throw in that wrench because their trouble is that they have to justify that their idea of a God, some personified entity, specifically now Jesus, which we're going to have to break down how that mythology is introduced into this cyclical movement of the earth that enforces them believing that this entity is so powerful as Jesus to create an Easter when he would have resurrected, which symbolically coincides with the rebirth of the gestation cycle of fertility in the northern hemisphere, where they would have been seeing the rebirth of plants around them occur. So it reinforced the belief that this mythos of Jesus resurrecting during that period actually was true. Meanwhile, it's the same thing that we had done with Osir in the Kemetic tradition, but because we recognize the new year in ancient Kemet in that region of the earth as coinciding first with the reappearance of the star Sirius, which we're talking about the Sirius star system, which is about 8.5 light years from the earth, that it appears in the sky, and the ancestors were able to first see it and acknowledge that the Nile River began to flood. And with these two natural law occurrences happening, they were able now to identify that yes, their own spring, or what would have been called Ishtar during the Greek reign, or Oset during the Kemetic reign of our ancestors, had commenced. You see it. And Oset to Ishtar is what becomes that reference to Easter, essentially. If you start to see the phonetic pronunciation evolving throughout the different cultures, all recognizing that there was a female archetype that was representative as a mother goddess, that the ancestors or naturalists gave an attribution to having life force or fertility, which is why the Romans would have called it a goddess of fertility, a mother goddess, and was always symbolized, holding the infant child. You see, which they equate now to Mary by the time they're coming out with extractions with their Jewish mythology that they created for Christianity. But what they're doing essentially, they're taking that idea that we had preserved in so many different traditions, right back to the Kemetic tradition of Ishtar, or said to represent that fertility period archetype and its harmonization with the regenerative forces of the earth, resurrection, because Osiris, the Greeks and Romans would have said, is a god of resurrection, to give you now a mythology that they had the personified beings of it, but it had to represent natural law occurrences of the earth. The regeneration is the resurrection of the cycles of the earth, which are occurring now, because as the earth is moving around the sun now, it's reached a point at what they call the vernal equinox, when the duration of sunlight on the earth during the day and night is going to actually be equal. And this, we have also the autumnal equinox, which is in September. It's the same natural phenomena in which you have equal durations of night and day on the earth in its rotation of its orbit around the earth. And this is really important to grasp and understand it, because as our ancestors would be observing this phenomena happening on the planet, that, okay, wow, so we had an equal day and equal night, because we had calculated from this period that the night was shortest, and then, or the day was shortest. Like I say, it's wonderful when you really understand this level of observation. It gave you a starting point with the commencement of the rains, which allowed us to start planting, to have a first day of the year, which was natural. Not the January issue, which Julius had to do because he had realized the calendar was offset, that Gregory had to also correct in 1582. That's Pope Gregory the 13th in 1582, with the calendar system, which is still a solar calendar that our ancestors had created, that we are still following today under the Romans in a different presentation with Jesus Christ. Now, I hope you've been able to get the message and get the understanding of what we've been able to point out in this part 2 of this segment, looking at the idea of the equinox and the solstice, because it's very key and it's very important. You see it, because I say people are going to be celebrating their Lent and their Easter during this period, and their attribution is a belief in gods and attributing what is now happening on the earth as the rebirth and regeneration of plants to what is really a solar deity called Jesus, which is just a recreation of ancient Kemetic solar deities, and particularly, not ancient Kemetic solar deities, but ancient mythological solar deities, and particularly the regenerational archetypal entity from the ancient Commetans. I mean, like I say, it blows a lot of people's minds to hear this because they normally want to look at the context of Christianity as being like the word of God, you know, handed from out of heaven, outer space once again, through some tradition of prophets that came out of some man who came to earth by a virgin. And I think we did a video on that. I don't want to get into all of that. But in spiritology, like I say, we're giving you awakened soul knowledge. So with that, we're going to drop this part 2 and then come back into the part 3 so that we can develop the concept still more holistically about this idea of the equinoxes and the solstices. And if you're able to really get to the part 4 of all of this truth, I'm going to give you all a little treat at the end, you know, because all work and no play or all reasoning and thinking without getting a little bit of beats. You know, we're going to give you all a little musical interlude at the end of the part 4 to relax you before we get into our next segment of freestyle lecture is going to be coming. So that's what we're going to drop out, saying peace, profound, and part 3 is coming up. Stay with us. Make sure you do click like and share this video if you've appreciated the knowledge that you've got up until this point.